This episode is brought to you by the Command Presence Leadership Institute. Find out more by visiting commandpresence.net.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership with Michael Warren. Be the leader you wish that you had.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership podcast, where we believe that leadership is about two things. It's about people and it's about actions. We talk with leaders from across society who are stepping up to do what they can, where they are, with what they have. The question is, what can we learn from each other as we strive to be the leader we wish we had? Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Warren, and I'm your host. Thank you for being with us today. Folks, I hope you had time to listen to last week's episode. It's a little bit different than the ones we've had before because it was just me. I kind of explained where we've been with the podcast so far and where we hope to go. To be honest with you, where we wanted to go, one of the places we wanted to visit, if you will, is going to be the topic of our conversation today. Because today, folks, we're going to take a trip into a world that very few people ever get to see. And the truth of the matter is, most of the people who do get to see it don't appreciate the fact that they had to see it because they're not there willingly. We're going to take a trip into a place that, in my opinion, is very dark and very scary. I would be the first one to admit, folks, that I'm not sure. In fact, I'm pretty sure I couldn't do the job that the brave women and men who work in this environment, and they step up daily and they serve their community by working there. And today, folks, we're blessed to be able to meet one of those folks. Our guest today is the host of the Prisoner Officer podcast, which you can find, folks, at theprisonerofficer.com. That will also be in our episode notes. Mike has been in corrections for more than 30 years. And that's a long time to be doing anything, but it's certainly a long time to be working in that environment. He has retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons as the Chief of the Office of Emergency Preparedness, the Director of Correctional Training for Command Presence, and a Master Instructor for Pepperball. He is a correctional consultant specializing in the use of force and physical security. He's a writer, a content creator, and a speaker on leadership and crisis management. And as we alluded to just a minute ago, folks, I can't tell you how excited I am that he's one of our newest instructors at Command Presence. He is the author of the Prison Officer Podcast Job Guide, and it's a collection of short stories and poetry that he put into a book called Monotonous Chaos. I've spoken to Mike before, and that was one of his coping mechanisms when he was working in the dark place, and I think that that's an incredibly insightful thing. He's published more than 50 articles in print and online. Folks, please welcome to the podcast, Mike Cantrell. Mike, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
Mike, was I accurate there when I described this environment where you spent your career as this dark and scary place? But I'll be the first to admit this. I've been to prison, not in prison. I've been to prisons before for the purposes of following up on investigations and conducting interviews, that type of thing. But I didn't have to, quote unquote, live there like the folks that do work there. So most of my exposure to corrections has been through movies and TV, and we recognize that's not always accurate. But would the description that I gave of your work environment, would that be at least partially accurate?
Oh, absolutely. It is a dark place. It is a place full of, often depending on the level, of course, but there's always a violence, manipulation, the things that society frowns on go on in there like it's normal. And that's what's so hard on the correctional officers is that darkness normalizes itself after a certain amount of time. You almost feel comfortable in that darkness and with that violence and just the way prison is.
Well, it's one of those things where we don't want to become complacent about it. But the reality is that is the reality, that is the reality of that particular environment. And so I guess the first question that really needs to be answered is, what in the world made you decide that was a place that you wanted to work? Because there's a lot of people who wouldn't even consider that as a career path simply because it is so dark and violent.
Yeah. In my own interviews with people, that's the first question because I'm fascinated about how people got there, and every answer is different. Mine's different than anybody else I've heard. I was working overseas on a government contract as a cook. Came back to Missouri on a leave, fell in love with my wife of now 30 plus years, and decided I needed a job and insurance. We were going to start a family, and I saw this ad for a cook at Missouri State Pen. And I was a cook, so I sent in my resume and stuff, and a couple of days later, this lady calls me, and she said, "We don't need cooks." She said, "You want to be a CO?" And I said, "What's a CO?" I thought it was some type of, other cook job. But she said correctional officer. And my father was a firefighter. I grew up with the firefighters and police officers in my house, so public service was something I was surrounded by. And I mistakenly, I take that back. It is a public service. I just didn't realize how far or how much differently the public looks at that public service than they do the firefighters and the police officers. That was one of the first things I went, oh, well, this is different.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because there are so many jobs that are being done on behalf of the public that are out of the public eye that people really don't think about. Like the water treatment plant. Very few people ever see the water treatment plant, but if it ever went down, they would realize the lack of it pretty daggone quickly. And I think it's the same for our correctional people, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. They keep 250,000 inmates in jails and prisons across the country. They keep them in prison every year. But the minute one escapes, it's all over the news. Everything's bad, all that stuff. And you can't find another job that has that level of looking out for the bad things to go wrong. It's a level that you can't get in any other job. One out of 250,000, and all of a sudden you've done it bad.
That's a heavy burden to bear. I mean, because unfortunately, when there is a lapse, when there is a failure, it often results in something catastrophic. So it's a heavy burden to bear. But you brought up something interesting. I got to call you out on this just a little bit, because there seems to be in society today one of the prevailing pieces of advice that goes out there for young people is to follow your passion, follow your dreams. And you seem to have taken a different path. You weren't necessarily following your passion when you took the first job, but your job became your passion. And I think that there's something to be said there, because you didn't even know what a CO was. So if you didn't know what it was, how could you possibly be passionate about it? And so I think the lesson here is for people to recognize that sometimes finding your passion can be the result of trial and error. Lucky for you, it worked out pretty quickly. It turns out cooking wasn't your passion.
No, and let me add a little to that, Mike. I not only that wasn't my passion for probably the first at least a dozen years. I hated that job.
Really?
I absolutely hated going to work every day. And at the time I was putting in, back then, police departments, when they'd hire, there was 500 people, and you had to go through a physical and a written test. And if you could get in the top 10, you might get hired, so I was going to the fire department, the police departments, trying to get hired. Nothing was working. And so I just continued doing that job. And it wasn't until I had the opportunity to promote that my life changed. I mean, I tell this story. I literally walked out in the parking lot one day, and I'd worked like 4 16-hour shifts in a row. Everything was just falling down. I couldn't find my car in the parking lot because I didn't remember where I parked 16 hours ago. And I decided I had to change something. I had to fix the way I was living. And the way I did that was actually put together a personal vision statement for myself, just for me, not for everybody else, but just for me, that said, this is why I'm doing this. I'm going to lead for those that can't. I'm going to go in here and do a job for the people I'm in charge of, and do it in a manner that motivates them as well. That day was what changed. And that was when I started looking at corrections in a different light. I started looking at the opportunities, and there are opportunities in corrections, especially for a guy like me who graduated high school. I didn't graduate college. I don't have a degree. And yet I went to become a chief in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And you can't do that with every job. It was something I learned. It wasn't something I started very quickly at. I hated it for years and had to learn to love it.
Way back in episode 1, we had David Salters on as one of our guests. And we talked about the changes in the job market. I think your story kind of highlights how we as leaders had to reframe things, because you stayed as a matter of necessity, because there wasn't another option available to you that provided the things like the medical insurance, like you talked about, starting a family and everything.
Sure.
That you, not for lack of trying, you were looking for an option. There just wasn't one available. Well, now with the shortages we have in the job market, there are other options. And I think that leaders need to realize that, and they need to treat people the way they should be treated, and quite honestly, should have been treated all along. And so we want people to stay because they choose to, not because they have to. For you, it sounds like it worked out all right, at least in the end, sticking with a job that you hated because it eventually brought you the passion that was needed.
And I hated it because I noticed the change in myself. I was a pretty happy-go-lucky guy when I was younger. I really wanted to grow up to be a writer. That job quickly turned me dark. You walk in, and I worked penitentiaries most of my career. So it's not like, I was hanging out at a camp somewhere. I was seeing violence daily. I was seeing manipulation every moment of every day. And that was something coming from small country town, that you don't run into manipulation at that level. And then all of a sudden I walked in there and everybody was trying to get something over on me. And it made me dark. And that was what I hated about that job, was the changes that it found in me.
It's one of those things where I've heard it put like this. You have to be careful that while you're trying to make a change in others, that others aren't making a bigger change in you. And I'm not saying we shouldn't change, because all of us can certainly improve, but oftentimes the changes that come about are of a negative perspective. And it sounds like that's kind of what happened to you.
It did. It absolutely did. And my family can tell you that. I mean, they went through that with me, the downs and then hopefully the back up, as I improved. But there was some bad times.
Often one of the bad times that leaders experience, especially young leaders, are when they get that first promotion. And now you said that your passion really came about after you got that first promotion. But people often struggle with that first promotion, that making that leap from buddy to boss. And now you're supervising the people that you were doing stupid stuff with last week. So what was it that you found most difficult when you got your first promotion? What was the aspect of it that you struggled the most?
I will tell you, I didn't struggle, and I'll answer the rest of that, but I didn't struggle as much as my buddy, and I'll just call him John. But him and I came in at the same time, and it's an absolute contrast, and I talk about this in training, because we both were officers. He was going out to the bar every night with the group. They were going to parties. They'd go do this together. They were out on the weekends, even if it was a Tuesday, Wednesday, but they were doing stuff all the time, and he was a buddy. And I never approached my job that way. As soon as I was able, I was getting on special teams, moved up into a team leader position, was acting supervisor for a while. So when we got promoted the same day. I came back in the next day and things were kind of the same, because I had, even though I wasn't the actual leader, I had set myself up as someone who was motivating others, who was influencing others, who was getting things done. And when John came in, he had to kind of fight, because they turned against him, because now he was making decisions that the officers didn't like sometimes and weren't used to seeing that side of him. So I got to see that, and it was a real dichotomy to see the two of us come into that at the same time. The one thing, and I didn't learn this till later on, was strategic and tactical leadership. I had been really good at tactical leadership. I'd been on teams. I was used to grabbing 5 people or 10 people and saying, let's go. We're going to go through the door. You go left, you go right. I was used to that. It was the strategic portion of leadership that nobody ever sat down and talked to me about, where you have to back up and you have to look, at the whole picture. In corrections, we do a lot of use of forces, cell entries, when we have to take care of an inmate who's acting out or not complying with orders and stuff. So we'll put together 5 guys, and a lieutenant leads that team. And that was a really hard thing for me to stand outside the cell and send 5 people in. And I felt very lost with that. And that was because I wasn't ready for the strategic portion of that job.
Well, you talk about, looking forward. I think one of the best analogies is that the farther up you go in the formal chain of command, the further down the road you have to look.
Yeah.
And we like living and working in the immediate, but I want to throw this to you from a tactical standpoint. Okay. Mm-hmm. I watched a documentary because I'm that kind of dork, right? I was watching a documentary. There's a mini documentary mini series of documentaries on being caught in a storm. And there was a snowstorm a couple years ago that was sweeping across America that was causing all kinds of havoc. I mean, it was killing people. And in Ohio, there was this whiteout, and it caused this huge pileup on the interstate. When, for whatever reason, a leader their vision for down the road is obscured, the only way to really handle it is to slow down. And if you're a hard charging leader, if you're the entry guy, I think that a lot of young leaders especially struggle with that slow down capacity when you can, to take advantage of the time and instead of just go, 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 go.
Yes, absolutely. That's the way I was. I was always moving. I was always doing. And sometimes as a leader, you have to plant yourself and you have to be the cornerstone. People look to you. They're looking back to you each time they go out and do their job. And that could be as little as a use of force team, or that could be as big as a riot or a natural disaster, where you and the way you stand yourself there is kind of like that solid oak grounds everybody else around you. And that's hard to do when you're a person who's used to doing.
Yes.
And it was hard for me.
Those who are considered by others or consider themselves to be hard chargers often struggle with the allowing others to do. Mm-hmm. But that's what's required of the leader. It's an interesting point here. I got to bring this up. Everybody has been behind that driver. Mike, you and I are getting of the age where we may become that driver. And the driver that I'm talking about is the person who does 38 miles per hour no matter where they're at, no matter what kind of road. Interstate, 38 miles an hour. School zone, 38 miles an hour. That you know the ones I'm talking about. They're incredibly consistent.
I do.
That can be dangerous, especially if you're a leader, because there's a reason why you have a gas pedal and a brake, is because there are times to get on the gas and there are times to get on the brake. I think that's a skill that has to be intentionally developed, and it's best developed under the mentorship, the coaching of somebody who has been through that transition before. And so the next question I'd like you to kind of reflect on is, as you moved up the chain of command, and now you became that person with that experience where you could start to mentor and coach the new leaders, how did you handle, because I think at that level right there, the further up you get, you have to have a different perspective that's required of your position. But in order to be truly effective, you also have to have an understanding of what's going on with the frontline CO. How does a leader go about striking that balance? How do you stay current with what's going on, but being able to look into the future and predict what's going to happen down the road?
Sure. It's something that's so needed today. It's something that we're losing. When I came up, leadership was taught, and it was taught management by walking around. And yes, I know we're tied to our, computers, we're tied to our offices and phones more than ever, but you can't forget that. I see so many people, and when I went to DC, I saw it the most, people who were totally removed from what was going on in the institution, because they'd been up in, Washington, D.C. in central office for 10, 15 years. And I think those kind of appointments, this is my personal opinion, need to be limited. They need to go back out in the field, because that's the only place you're going to find out what is going on with your prison. And it's not always about people talk, well, go talk to the COs, go talk to the staff, go talk to the inmates if you work in prison. They'll let you know, some of what's going on. You got to take it with a grain of salt, but they're involved in this small community as much as everybody else. And as a captain, I tried to move around as much as possible. And when I couldn't, I would bring people to my office. That's how I kept current on what was going on. And surrounding yourself, know where your weaknesses are, and find people who aren't weak in that and have them come, have a talk once a week or report to you or send you an email, whatever it takes. But find that person with the strengths in those areas and let them tell you about, I didn't know anything about food service. So I had to get very close with the food service manager because in prison, food matters a lot. 3 times a day.
It's like currency sometimes, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's currency. It's their whole life. Some of the guys that are locked down in cells, you're literally waiting 6 hours for the next meal, and that's all they're thinking about, because sometimes there's not much going on other than that. And then if they don't get a good meal, that can set the tone for the rest of the shift. So I didn't know a lot about how food service ran in there. And so I, made friends with the food service manager. I made friends with the facility manager. Those were people who I talked to every week, to know what's going on inside my prison, along with doing rounds and checking with the correctional officers and the supervisors and the inmates.
You told us that you came looking for a job as a cook. So you have some experience with food service.
Sure.
And I think that that's something that leaders often overestimate the breadth and quality of their personal experience. They fail to recognize the difference in application in a different industry, or maybe even in just a different company or a different shift. I would have to say that shifts are markedly different in a correctional environment. I would be willing to bet that midnights is significantly different than working days.
Absolutely. Totally different culture. Just to back up a little bit, I think you're absolutely right about knowing what you don't know. Okay. Now, yes, I was a cook, but if I purchased small pieces of chicken for an Air Force base and I wasn't going to have a riot, you do that in prison, you may have violence over that if these people get little pieces of broken chicken legs and it's their whole meal. So I had to understand the things I didn't know, even though I knew a little bit about it. And that's something you can carry off into everything. But yeah, the culture on the different shifts, they're absolutely different. Different people want to work different shifts. You've got guys that will never leave midnights, that will never leave evenings because they enjoy it. They like not having the admin around is what some of them will tell you. I will warn people, though, be careful with getting stuck on those off shifts for years because it's not healthy. Your body needs sunlight. It needs regular sleep. So don't do that for too long.
Well, it's interesting to me because we will find people who choose what many would consider to be an undesirable part of a job. But for whatever reason, it clicks for them. It works for them. Yeah. And I think leaders have to be careful about the way in which they approach them and give them advice. Hey, don't stay here too long. Because if I find somebody who's really good at being a midnight janitor, or maybe somebody who's good at being a midnight cook, whatever the job may be, or you know what, in the financial world, trading goes on 24 hours a day, and we have to have people working midnights. If I find somebody who not only is good at doing that, but actually enjoys it, I have to be careful that I don't try to lure somebody who fills a need into an area that maybe they're not so good at.
True. But you need to make sure and ensure that we're supporting them at the same level we are the other staff, because they get forgotten there. And those off shifts, and I've met guys who've been on shift, midnights for 15 years. Your family is going to suffer from that. Your life is going to suffer from that. So we've got to make sure that we're supporting them and giving them what they need. And that may be flexible schedules. That may be time to, off time so that they can actually spend it with their families and stuff. Right now, corrections, these guys, the number one thing you hear out of these guys is, they just want 2 days off in a row. They can't get it right now. They're working 16 hours, 4 or 5 days a week. And, getting mandatoried on some of those before they leave their shift. So they're not getting the family time. And that really works on a person. That's how they're losing a lot of these staff right now.
Well, and then when they lose a staff, it makes the situation worse. But I think you just brought something forward there that I think leaders have to consider. What one person may see as a reward, somebody else may see as a punishment. And so I think that leaders have to know their people so that we are intentional in what we assign.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, buddy, I'm not so sure about this remote work thing. You know what I'm saying? But for other people, they'd rather quit than go back and work in an office. And so I think that the leader has to be aware of it, and we can't meet everybody's desires.
No.
When afforded the flexibility and we can help them out to meet what works best for them, I think that leaders should do that.
Sure. And I think leaders should, and this is just what's going on in my world right now, some of the stuff I'm seeing. There was a certain way that schedules were done when I was coming up through corrections, and a lot of the people that learned that same stuff are in leadership positions now. Well, there's other ways of scheduling. We've got to come to an agreement somewhere in the middle with the newer generation who does want a better work-life balance, who's willing to be flexible, but not flexible like I was, which was, I got 2 more extra shifts for you. They're willing to be flexible to move around. Leaders have got to take a look at how we can, there's some apps out there that allow staff to do their own scheduling and swapping, which is a viable option. But people my age and with 30 years in, that's scary to not have a lieutenant being the one with the pencil. So there's options out there, but we've got to grow as leaders all the time and make sure that we're looking and talking and understanding what the problem is. It's not always what we think it is.
It's a great point. I guess the next question becomes, and again, this is based off your experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
When do you think is an appropriate time for people to actually start preparing for a promotion? Or we can also reframe it. At what point do you think it's appropriate for an organization to start training their people for a potential promotion? Is there a sweet spot? Is there any downside to doing that? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think that's very relevant to a lot of stuff that's going on now. When are they ready to start thinking about promotion? Well, my answer to that's going to be, have you mastered most of your job that you're doing now? Do you know how to do the basics? Not can you get through the shift, but are you doing the basics? Do you know why and how? Door checks. It's something I hardly ever see anymore. A rookie officer needs to be taught about door checks so that every time he takes over a unit, every time he walks somewhere, he's constantly reaching over and grabbing the doorknob to make sure it's locked. It's just an extra security procedure when we're inside to make sure something wasn't missed. And I see a lot of people who aren't learning that type of basic and aren't mastering that, but yet they're willing to run up the chain. So what we'll end up with is a supervisor who doesn't understand the basics. So that's my answer. Once you've mastered the basics, once you're able to run a housing unit by yourself and you're doing the correctional basics that everybody needs to do, then it's time to look for promotion. But as far as getting yourself ready, you can do that all the time. Leadership is what? It's influence. You can influence other people the very first day of work just with your attitude. Come in with a good attitude and it'll spread. Motivation. That's another leadership skill. That can be something you do from day one. So you can absolutely be working on becoming and being looked at as a leader like I was versus John. But you need to take that moment and understand the basics also. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I liked what you said at first, because once you mastered the basics, even though you hadn't been formally recognized as a leader, that you didn't occupy one of the supervisory spots in your organizational chart, then you started trying to expand your base and you took on additional assignments and you went to additional training. And I think that in addition to giving you more credibility as a leader and as a future formal leader, I think it also gives you exposure to things that maybe, you know what, that's not my strong suit. That's not my area. And quite honestly, I don't enjoy it. So it also keeps you from going down the wrong pathway, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you're not going to have to tell people when you're ready to be a leader. If you're doing those things and they see you with a good attitude, and, motivating others and influencing others up and down the chain, they're going to recognize it. You're going to stand out. That's what I tell people. Corrections, it's so easy to stand out. Go in there and do your job. Go in there with a good attitude. Go in there with a can-do attitude, and people are going to see you, and they're going to give you the opportunities that are there. And there's thousands of opportunities. You don't have to just stay a correctional officer your whole career. You can go up into facilities, food service, education, counselor, case manager. Those are all jobs that start off as a correctional officer. The options are endless.
I think it's interesting when you think back to old military units. Mm-hmm. They oftentimes would elect their own leaders. It wasn't something that they were appointed to. A company would elect their company commander, and based upon what I'm not that old, Mike. I wasn't part of the election process. From my research, what has been interesting to me is it wasn't really in most cases a personality contest, and instead it was a recognition from the group on who is most likely going to get us home safely, who is going to allow us to accomplish the mission with the fewest of casualties. Mm-hmm. So I think what you said there about people recognizing when you're a leader, I think it should be pointed out that you may not be a leader in everything. You may be a leader in some tasks, but there may be other leaders who are recognized in others. And the best leaders are the ones who not only don't fight that, they buy into it because somebody else does something better than they do.
Absolutely. There's lots of people that do things better than I do. Investigations. I found people and surrounded me out of the investigations unit because they kept me up on what was happening. Like I talked about food service. And that even goes downwards because if you've ever read, and I know you have, It's Your Ship, I absolutely believe his concept in there of finding your people who are good at something, putting them in an area where they can succeed with what they're good at. Now, that's not saying you shouldn't expand, your horizons and that you shouldn't reach out of your comfort zone. But people who are successful and feel successful and are allowed to grow, those are people that are going to stay around. And people who, you talked about the way they voted for that guy. Everything that you mentioned there was different ways that leader cared about the people. And when people understand that, they will follow you. Once they understand that you care about them, not your political aspirations, which is a problem that we're having these days. People are getting promoted so fast. There's no continuity because they're hitting these political jobs as quick as they can. Federal Bureau of Prisons, I think it was, and I may be off on the years, somebody can correct me, but it's close. Norm Carlson was director of the Bureau of Prisons for 17 years. Now, people knew what to expect. Now, there's going to be people argue, things didn't change or shouldn't change or whatever, but he was a person who looked outside of what he knew and made that the new bureau. But you had continuity. We don't have much continuity in leadership anymore, and I think that hurts.
There used to be a lot of turnover at the frontline positions, no matter the industry. If you're working at McDonald's, you tend to get a lot of turnover on your afternoon shift.
Yep.
But now turnover rate has shifted and has started moving upward. And there certainly can be a negative impact when when the people who are working, who are doing the job, don't have an understanding of what is expected of them and how business is done.
Absolutely. And it's something we've got to take a look at. How do we get people to stay in those management jobs? How do we make that something they want to do? Because, and it was something that meant a lot to me, was I changed the way I was when I was able to serve others. When I got into got promoted, got into a position and became a recognized leader, not just a authority figure, but a recognized leader, I got so much from being able to serve others, being able to change things. And I still do. That's why I'm still failing retirement horribly, because I'm working harder now than I did when I was employed in corrections. But I get to go out every week and make changes and help people and give them the tools that they need to go out there and do a better job and to be safer. I think that's something that we talk about, this retention. If you want to retain employees, make them valued, make them knowledgeable, and make them feel safe. And that really means something in corrections, because if they feel like there's somebody else running to their body alarm, if they feel like they know the why that they do something, the reason there's a rule, not just regurgitating rules, but they can actually stand up in front of an inmate and say, no, we're not going to do this, because then you have knowledgeable staff. And that's what keeps staff around. When they walk in there, and I'll tell you, everybody that's walked into prison is scared when they first walk in. I was, and anybody that says they're not is telling you a fib. But that fear quickly went away as I became knowledgeable, as I became supported. And that wasn't only by leadership, that was also by the mentoring staff that I had at the time. And I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but I talk to a lot of people, and they tell me, this newer generation, they're not listening to me, so I'm just not talking. Guys, we can't do this. There's nobody else to fill these jobs. We've got to show them what we know. We've got to give them the tools they need to succeed and become good correctional staff or police officers or firefighters, whatever. But we've got to show them how to do this and how to do it well, because everybody depends on these jobs. We can't just throw our hands up.
And I think that transcends industries too. We can say whatever we want to about the younger generation, but we need computer programmers.
Sure.
But we need them to know how to do it safely and safeguard against intrusions on protected information, right? We need new healthcare workers. It just transcends. And I think there's another thing that you kind of talked about, and it really resonates with a book that I read recently called Leading from the Middle by Scott Motz. And he goes, we can't promote everybody, and not everybody wants to be promoted. What we need to start reimagining as a leader is how do we let people grow within their position? Perhaps that means that we need to allow people to redefine their positions, where, hey, this has not typically been done by this particular assignment in our company, but you've shown how it can be done. And so now we're going to morph that position into something different, because we don't want to wait 17 years and things be exactly the same. And now we have a catastrophic changes being thrown at us. And I just think that's a safer way about going about it, if a leader is willing to reimagine what it means to be promoted, because maybe promotion within a position is the way we need to go.
And let me talk about ownership. And I've written on this a couple of times, and I'm going to take it back to like a tactical team. Okay. When you've got a tactical team with, say, 20 members on it, I can't make everybody the team leader and the assistant team leader. There's just not enough there. So in order to give people ownership on my teams, what I did was put them in charge of parts of that team. And we see that. I use this example because it's fairly easy to follow. I had 3 breachers who were trained in breaching. Now, not everybody was my lead breacher, but I had 3 breachers, so I had some backup. You have your sniper, right? Sniper team. You have people that you put in charge of, taking care of all the equipment and everything, and make them in charge of that, so that it's important that it gets there and it's ready and nobody else has to look for it because they're doing their part. And what you're doing piece by piece there is giving every single member of the team ownership of that team, even if it is just a part. And we can do that at work. The officer that we're leaving out there on their own in a housing unit with 60 inmates, and we're talking to him once a shift, doesn't feel ownership. So let's get him involved. Why can't he be part of developing the next policy? Why can't he be part of some of these meetings that we have on how we're going to improve morale or how we're going to do things better in the institution? That ownership plays a lot with the new generation. They don't all have to be the vice president, but they do want to have a say, and they want to be part of the changes that happen. and the successes that happen. So
I think that's a great point. And I got to take you back just a few minutes to something else you said, because based on your experience, because everybody's is different, one of the things you talked about was that the election of leaders and the other pieces of that right there, it came back to the leader sincerely caring for the people that they have been entrusted with. So in your experience, if somebody lacks that care for their people, is that a deal killer for you? Is that something you just can't abide by? If you've got a leader that you're working for that just doesn't care about you, or you're supervising a subordinate who's in a leadership position and they just quite honestly don't care about the people they have?
It's going to affect everybody around them because it has to do with authenticity. You know, if you're pretending to be in a leadership position, yet people see that you don't care. And I'll take this down one more level. If you're a correctional officer and the inmates don't believe that you care about their safety, because that is one of the things we're in charge of in there. If they don't feel like it's a safe place to live in that housing unit because you're not being authentic and you're not caring about them, you're going to have more weapons in that housing unit because they're going to take care of themselves. And I think that same thing happens at all levels. When they don't feel that authenticity, if they don't feel like you're there for the right reasons, they're going to go off on their own and you're not going to have influence. You're not going to be able to bring people to the table when it comes time to make changes or put projects together or whatever it is, because you've lost that authenticity.
I think you just said something incredibly profound. Failing to make it safe for others vicariously makes it unsafe for you, makes it more unsafe for you. And so we shouldn't be doing things for self-serving reasons, but there is skin in the game for the leader who fails to make it safe for their people. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think that goes through every profession. I think corrections is this small focused area that you're going to notice that quicker. But I think that happens in every profession. You're going to see people not feel safe, not cared for, and they're going to float away.
That's a great point, man. I've got one other thing because we've talked about it on a previous episode. We've had several guests that have mentioned it, but one in particular, Grayson Story, talked about how moral, courageous leadership is a force multiplier. It expands your influence as a leader. And you brought up several times the manipulation that goes on in a correctional environment. So I would have to imagine that it's incredibly important in that context of having leaders who do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, because you're more likely to have people that work for you that do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. Is that what you found?
Sure. You're being a mentor at all times when you walk around, and people, especially when you're in a leadership position, they're watching you to see what you do. And in a correctional facility, that's inmates and staff. And if you're not moral, if you're not ethical, then you're giving permission to everybody else to not be moral and ethical. And I'll throw out a perfect example from the Bureau of Prisons, and it's not a pretty one. But out at, we have a female prison, Dublin, that's been in the news for the last couple of years. Well, they caught the warden having sexual relations with one of the female inmates. And after that, they caught 7 more staff. That warden doing that, people in the prison knew what was going on to some level. He was giving permission to others to do the same thing. And so how we carry ourselves absolutely affects everybody else. They look to us to set the standard. And if we're not setting that standard, if we're not ethical, if we're not moral, then you're given permission. Inmates are another example that you're going to see real quick in corrections. If I go out and I use foul language when I talk to inmates, I'm giving the other inmates the permission to use foul language when they talk to me. But if I go out and I carry myself a certain way and I treat them like a human and I treat them with respect, then they're going to more than likely, most of the time, I got that respect back. And I think that's from the lowest level of leadership to the highest level of leadership.
That is a fantastic point, because we've discussed it before on this podcast. It has been my experience that the way in which our people interact with people outside the organization is a direct reflection of how we are interacted with internally.
Every day.
It would seem like that would be even more magnified in a correctional environment, simply because it's such a closed system. But it's a closed system that is intimately close.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely do correctional officers have the benefit of distance. I mean, in order to do their job, there is a closeness, a proximity that has to occur. So it's even more magnified, at least based upon my outside perspective.
Yeah, everything's magnified in there because we are, 60, 100, 120 inmates in a housing unit with one or two officers. You're tight quarters. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody sees what everybody else does. So yeah, you can't hide from, and if there's one piece of advice I give new correctional officers, it's go in there and be you. I'm from the country. I'm, Southern Missouri. So I was grown up saying, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. And I used to catch a lot of flack because when I'd talk to inmates, I'd say, step over here, sir. I need to pat you down. Well, don't call him sir. He doesn't deserve that respect. I don't know his name. I call inmates mister. I call him sir. That doesn't bother me because I'm not saying I agree with everything that you did. I'm saying right now at this moment, I'm a professional and I'm going to treat you with the respect of a professional. And I'm going to ask you nicely to step over here so I can do a pat search. And you'll see people who, go all up in arms over that. I've got a friend who's extremely religious. He's a Christian. He portrays that outside and he portrays that inside. And when he talks to the inmates, if something comes up, he'll quote something out of the Bible to them. And people would say, you shouldn't bring your religion in. He's not. He's bringing who he is in. They can immediately tell if somebody's not authentic. It's their job. They grew up in even growing up, with crime and stuff like that. They automatically had to recognize whether or not someone was manipulating them because they were so surrounded by it, if that person was authentic. So they can do the same thing with us. Be authentic when you go inside.
Mike, as we wrap things up here, I just want to paraphrase what you said there, because I think the way that we treat others is a reflection of who we are, not of who they are.
Yeah.
And if we treat people poorly, then that says a lot more about us than it does about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is the part of the program where I tell you what I think that my biggest takeaways were, but I always do it on air because I want you to be able to correct me and say, Mike, that was not what I said at all. So let me just run through these with you real quick and give you a chance to make sure I got them right. And also if you want to add anything to it. First takeaway, your passion may not be the reason why you get in the profession, but you may find your passion in the profession.
Absolutely.
You said this, said it a little bit differently. The change that is required may be a change in your perspective, not necessarily in something else.
That's how it worked for me. My perspective and how I looked at life changed. Nothing about my surroundings changed. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
How about leaders, especially young folks, that they can prevent future issues by limiting present stupidity? Do things correctly and do them for the right reasons. You're going to make your transition to formal boss much easier.
Yeah, people are going to recognize that. You stand out when you do that. And people are going to see that from a distance.
Master the basics.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to lead those when you are not technically proficient with the basics of the job. And then I love what you said about, listen, I can't make everybody a team leader, but I can make them a leader, a part of the team. And I was saying, I don't know why it popped into my head, but I was thinking about network security. Well, I may not be able to give a new person all the passwords for the entire system, but I can give them a part of the system for which you're responsible. And then they're going to take ownership and they're going to take pride. And then we can start expanding that ownership.
Yeah. If you read Jocko's book, Extreme Ownership, he doesn't just talk about the leader having ownership. he sees that go all the way down to the lowest person on the team. Everybody has ownership. And when you do that, when you're working in an environment where everybody has ownership, it's a blessing. It's the best place to work.
And then the last one, and it's ironic that you said it because Harvard Business Review, the magazine that came recently, actually had an article on safety, that safety has to go beyond mandates and requirements placed on you by governing bodies. You said, make it safe for your people. That one right there really hit home for me because I never considered that in the correctional context, that if the inmates don't feel safe, they're going to take measures to make themselves feel safer. And them doing that makes it less safe for your people. So if I want it to be safer for your people, I have to make it safer for them.
Absolutely. It's like you said, it's a micro look at a small community so we can see what goes on quickly. One more thing I'll add to that is, that is not a new concept. When I walked into prison 30 plus years ago, there were lieutenants and captains, and you probably felt the same way on the police department, lieutenants and captains who were just bigger than life. Mm-hmm. And I knew that no matter what happened today, they were going to get me out of there safe. And so that feeling of safety's always produced good staff.
Listen, when people feel unsafe, you start getting overreactions. And overreactions are always harmful. We get them in leadership. We overreact to a situation. We get bad policy. We get bad laws. We get bad assignments. So much happens when people feel unsafe, and you get those overs that always produce something bad.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Well, Mike, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Folks, listen, I appreciate you listening, but I would highly encourage you to head over and listen to the Prison Officer podcast at theprisonofficer.com. And we'll include the links to the podcast and to the writings and books and stuff on our episode page. It is amazing to me how we can find things in other industries that is applicable across the board. And I think this is one of those situations where on first glance, maybe you think, well, you know what, my industry has nothing to do with it, but I think you'll find that it does. So I would highly encourage you to do that. Go over, take a listen, look up some of his writings, look up some of the articles. I mean, I'm telling you, folks, it is insightful. But I do want to thank our listeners. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode, and we sure hope you did, and if you didn't, that asks a lot more questions that it answers. Be sure to follow Faces of Leadership on your favorite podcast provider. You can also find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website at commandpresence.net/podcast. Also, be sure to check us out on LinkedIn. And now I have big news. You can also find us on YouTube. So head on over to YouTube, look up the Faces of Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe over there. Something we're really excited about. Folks, we're working on some what we hope are nice surprises over on that particular platform. So stay tuned. But as we close out this episode, as always, please remember, be the leader you wish you had.